Good evening. My name's Philip Boyle, and I'm sitting down here to talk, and hope you can see the screen. I'd like to start with a text I've got at the top in yellow. The modern movement in architecture is an idea. It's a way of thinking and thinking about emancipation, egalitarian society, and the future. It is tremendously important. That was said by Hubert Jan Henket, who was he's an architect and was one of the founders of DOCOMOMO. While DOCOMOMO consists of both architects and academics, they come at things from different angles. But I think that message is, as time has gone on, since we're now well into the 21st century, we need to look at where the ideas come from. And that is the reason for having a talk on Adolf Loos, the Austrian architect, this evening. What is important historically is time and place. So I've put his dates underneath. Born 1870, died 1933. 1870, to relate him to a few things, clearly being Austrian, he was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at that time, in terms of place. But in terms of time, he's 3 years older than Le Corbusier, born in 67. Sorry, 3 years old. I must get my dates right. 87, yes. 17 years older than Le Corbusier, and 3 years younger than Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm relating him to those two because in terms of ideas in modernism, they're probably the most well known, although there were others. And the importance of that is that how people are influenced. I came to Loos through his students. His students, Rudolf Schindler and Richard Neutra and Ernst Freud, all of whom were taught by him. The two of those practiced in America, and in the late 90s, my son moved to live in Los Angeles, and I got to see lots and lots of their buildings and their architecture, and I traced it back to him. In relation, I started from Le Corbusier. I had towards new architecture, I think when I was 15, and that clearly was full of ideas, and clearly I then found that Le Corbusier's capacity for projecting and promotion stemmed from this man who wrote some pamphlets a lot earlier, from 1910 onwards, who was Adolf Loos. He's been described, I put underneath the dates, because the second thing about the dates, of course, is 1933. 1933 is the date that Hitler really took power in Germany. So he died. But clearly, having been born in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the First World War had quite an effect on him. Locally, there have been a number of books on those. I'm referencing two here, actually. The one there where the A is half missing is a great big tome, which you can only get in French and German, but is magnificent in describing his life. The one on the right, with smaller lettering, was produced by the Arts Council for an exhibition at the ICA in 87, mainly curated by Wilfrid Wang. I don't think I saw that exhibition at that time, but I did get this catalogue, and it had essays on him by John Summerson and Kenneth Frampton, amongst others. The pictures you see there are both of the same thing, actually. The bay window you can see there with the glazing of the two Doric columns, the Cipollino marble that they're made out of is what you see on the cover of the other book. I'm going to now go on and try and deal with him overall. I can only, in the time available here, really touch on a number of buildings, and I've highlighted highlighted them in red here. I could leave this text for you to read, but it has a sequence of things that basically he went to America in 1893 for 3 years, then returned to Austria and wrote extensively about design, and eventually got into building a series of basically houses for the Jewish bourgeoisie of that period. After World War I, he briefly held a period of, he was the city architect for Vienna for a couple of years until the regime changed. And he then moved to Paris and did a few more houses and died in 1933. To remind you of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because just what it was, here you can see how far it extended from the German one on the left to the Russian on the right, and south to Italy and to Serbia. Vienna being the, those of you who've watched television might have seen Sibel Montefiori's history of this, which is quite extraordinary, the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Vienna. Adolf Loos himself was born near Prague, in a village called Brunn, in this Bohemian area. I'm going to talk a bit about the context now in terms of, that's place where he is, okay, located, in terms of what was going on in Vienna during that period. A significant figure was Otto Wagner, who was for quite a time the city architect in Vienna, who did beautiful, rather nice restrained classical buildings, but also he had to deal with things like the new, what you can't read it there, but that's the new metro system that they had in Vienna. He designed all the stations for that, and those are, as a section and elevation of the stations, which were very beautiful, flat, plain, modest buildings. He also designed other buildings at that time. He designed a large sort of mental hospital, a church in it, with extremely white interior. I'm not showing you pictures of that, but the most famous building that he designed was a post office. With this, you can see this glaze scheme. It's quite famous, this building in central Vienna. It has the most marvelous ventilation shafts at the end here, which architects love. But you can see there the clear, simple lines, the use of light. He was quite modern, and he produced this book called Modern Architecture, which was based mainly on Sempe. The other thing that happened that late time in Vienna was the secession movement, which built its own gallery with a German architect, Ulrich, who was more of an Art Nouveau architect. It's shown there. You may well know it, but I mean the thing on top is just called the Golden Cabbage on top of the dome. It had these two flat planes either side of the door saying Versailles. The group of artists who used it or who were in it, they had this slogan: to art. To the age, it's art. To art, it's freedom. So, as part of that period in Vienna, the rebellions and the ideas that were flowing around and things going on, the artists join in. Here's a collection of them. Klimt, the most famous, is the man sitting in the chair in that building. It is Beethoven Frieze. And there's the slogan again. The other main influence then was Joseph Hoffmann, born the same year as Loos, who really moved the Werkbund forward and was actually an adversary of Loos. They argued a lot. What you can see at the bottom there is part of the sort of paintings that Klimt would do. Now, to come to Loos himself, his childhood was quite difficult. And I'll leave you to read what's there, but I will talk about it. But I just remind you that the two other figures I remind you of, Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, both of them had mothers who were, shall we say, helped them with their careers, but were there all the time. Frank Lloyd Wright's mother, when he was completely down and out, returning from Germany, having run away with somebody and come back again, supported him in moving on in his career. Similarly, Le Corbusier, throughout his life, conducted a correspondence with his mother, who lived to an age I think she was 93 or something when he was in his 60s, and was there in the family, although she was a musician and taught music, maintained an interest in him and was there as a solid background from his childhood. For Loos, it started off well. He was the first of 3 children. His father ran a sculpting and stone cutting workshop, which was also their family home. So the home and their income was in the same place. And clearly, so it was close-knit and probably fairly intimate. However, he died when Adolf was only 8 years old, and his mother then had the problem of a family to feed, keep going, and a business to run. And she took up with someone who was not particularly sympathetic to the children, as I understand it. He had a lot of trouble with his education. He never really settled at schools. He went to the higher technical school. He certainly read on architecture. He read Sempe and was very moved by Sempe's ideas about cladding and how you did it. But he couldn't get on a proper course because he hadn't got enough money or didn't know how to get money to pay the fees. So at that time, things being very bad. We hadn't quite got to there were the various revolutionary wars going on. He joined the army at a very young age as a volunteer. As part of that, of the growing up thing, he was taken to a brothel quite early on, at an early age, and he caught syphilis and had it extremely badly. He was very badly ill with that, laid out for a long time, and in fact, throughout his life, he was not that healthy. He suffered from a number of illnesses. So, relative to those other 2 architects, this is not a good way to start off. He eventually, because of his interest, in 1893 decided to go to America, and he had an uncle in Philadelphia who he got to. When he got there, he stayed for 3 years, and he had to survive, and he was greatly interested in the things that he found there at that time, from 93 onwards, which I'll come to in a minute. But the sort of jobs he did bricklaying, so he did work. He's really a maker type architect. He's not. He could draw, but he, having started with stone, he worked as a bricklayer. He worked as an ordinary shop assistant in Wonderwand, but he worked as a hairdresser's assistant, which is, if you know the sort of chatting that goes on in hairdresser thing, being the assistant, you communicate with people. You say something and you get a reaction. His social skill, just to survive. And plumber, he got devoted to American plumbing. Anyway, when he returned, he was full of ideas, and he produced various pamphlets and those amongst his friends in who I'll come to now in Vienna. As I say, he was described as this man with modern nerves, and he wrote sort of about his opinions on. I've got them here. I've read some of these, and I wouldn't put them up for you to read because they're terribly local and rather colloquial. But here's a list of, there are 36 subjects there, okay, that he held forth on. And when you think this was not the internet age, this was the age where main communication was by meeting people and talking to them, or going to bars, or sitting in bed, going to bars, or teaching, where you could raise various subjects. I don't know whether I should read all these out to you, but just some of them. I mean, Tristan and Isolde, the opera, food, clothing, sex. Sadly, because of the syphilis, he was impotent. But saddle chairs. Saddle chairs means saddles, how saddles are made, how the saddle sits on the horse and how you sit on the saddle on the horse. Masturbation, which I suppose is a subject I'm interested in. Shoes. Well, that's well known one these days. Hallmarks. Hallmarks were the sort of stamps on various metals by which you identified them and how those worked. Silverware, music, very much music. Music and theatre in Vienna at that time everybody was arguing about. Street decorations, death, suicide, flagpoles. Flagpoles, probably because of the regime, there were a lot of flags. So he had opinions about them. Etiquette, table manners, interior decoration, children, public morality, toilet paper. That stemmed from him being in the army. There was a big thing about the Austrian army that they weren't issued with toilet paper. Craftsmanship, hairdressers, taste, shop portals, shop windows, syphilis, newspaper boys, how they sold newspapers, the family as an influence in society, cooking, posters, pornography, gambling, and coquettes. I assume means, I don't know what coquettes are, but I know they're a girl of a certain sort. I'm going to move on now. That's the sort of thing that he did stuff about. And his friends, here's a list of people who, on his 60th birthday, 3 years before he died, wrote testimonials about him. And you can see there's a large number of various professions. I've highlighted in yellow ones he was particularly friendly with. Karl Kraus, the philosopher. Schoenberg, the composer, particularly. Tackle, the poet, but you can see in there people like Stefan Zweig, who wrote novels, Weber, another brother, Zara, who he did a house for eventually, Oskar Kokoschka, the painter. And I'm going to go on now. I mean, this is a portrait of Loos by Kokoschka, and he looks rather worn and worried in that. I mean, there are a lot of photos of him looking rather serious because he was ill at various times. Kokoschka also painted this woman, Bessie Bruce, who was an English dancer who he'd already been married and divorced, but he entered a relationship with her, which was probably, he had several relationships with women over his life, but this was probably the longest one, and she got very ill as well, and he spent a lot of time looking after her through the end of her life, and she, as well as helping him when he was ill. Compared with some of his other female compatriots, there are stories of like when he came to England with her, and she wanted to do something other. He was out buying knives and forks and various things because he really loved British artifacts. And I've got a photo of the two of them on their holds, okay? Because that was when a sort of more relaxed time. Just to give you an idea of being dressed up in Venice and being less than dressed up in Venice. A bit more text. Right? This is all culture before we actually get to the buildings themselves. Schoenberg, his friend, wrote in an essay called Harmony, which he dedicated right to Gustav Mahler. And you have to remember that Mahler's wife was later married to Gropius, so the exchanges between the avant-garde in music and architecture were thick at this time. So this is Mahler speaking, saying, tonality is a form which offers the possibility of achieving a certain unity through uniformity. But, he explains, I do not hold this to be an eternal law, a natural law of music, since eternal laws do not exist for us. And I think that's the important point. At that time, anything that was a law was being questioned. But only conditions that remain valid until they're superseded and eliminated wholly or in part by new conditions. In other words, that's a form of relativity, things being relative to each other. And Loos strips, what he did when he came to architecture, he strips the exterior meaning by enclosing the desire for habitability, a horrible clumsy word, but anyway, desire for, I think we know what it means, in the intimate interval between walls of language. What is being expressed about architecture, that of which one can speak, is not for Loos the function, but it is the shape of space. So I've highlighted that, shape of space. He's recognised that that's what architects deal with. In this way, he explains, I've taught my pupils, because he did teach, amongst all this meeting in cafes and things, he gave lessons to people at various places in various times, not in a structured school, and he goes on to say, I taught my pupils to think in 3 dimensions, to think in the cube. The architect has the wall at his disposal. By the means of the wall, he separates a space, fixing its boundaries, and in his realm, the German word for room, one can try and live, to express one's private existence and to show one's own bad taste. So, although Corbusier would talk about volumes, cubes, spheres, triangles, as geometric shapes. Loos was thinking of them in terms of a shape of space, and was also concerned for the person's private existence as well as being on show. In other words, the outside of your building is on show, other people see it. Inside, it's yours for you to see. You should be able to make the choice. I'll leave all that hanging in here. When he went to America, I'm showing you here not pictures by him, but by Eric Mendelsohn, who went a bit later, that if you're an immigrant from Europe, you arrived in New York and you saw this lot of stuff, which was an awful lot of architecture and building, particularly in that area. He formed a fascination with things American and things English as well. For Loos, the positive side of America, democracy attained, right, you know, going there in the late 1990s, lies in its extension of the process of the German word Kulturverjüngung, becoming civilized from the city to the country, the relationship between if you're in a city or you're in the country. This is in the surmounting of old hierarchies and cultural barriers between different living conditions. Loos speaks of an America interpreted by a European. His deliberate transfiguration has the function of prefiguring advanced solution to the knotty problems of the world, worn out by the conflict between nostalgic preservation of ancient values, that's what architects were doing a lot at that time, and the growth without qualities of new modes of production. In other words, production of things that you didn't quite know what to do with them. In this way, America becomes, he called it the other, which in German was das andere, which is how he titled his holding forths that he published when he got back. This is essential to an understanding of the provocative way in which he constantly contrasts the model of Anglo-Saxon culture with that of German culture. For Loos, the English culture, and by extension the American one, harbors a dominant German culture. Dormant, sorry. I hope you've swallowed all that. Basically what he was saying is that the future belongs to the man in overalls, the man who does things and makes them. And I'm going to quickly show you a few pieces of architecture that were made in the late 90s. I can't show them at length because they're quite big buildings, but this is a drawing of the edge of Chicago facing Lake Michigan, and it shows the auditorium building designed by Alder and Sullivan in 1886. This building occupied one whole half of what was the urban layout of Chicago, which was a grid. Which was a grid, a rectangular grid, as you get in Manhattan and a lot of American cities. So you had a building that occupied this piece of city, and within it there were a large number of functions. There was an enormous theatre, there was a hotel, there was residential, there was offices. And by means of what you could do structurally with the steel frame, they were all put together and all put up. You can't see it very clearly that there is a steel frame that runs through the foyer to the theatre is here with a grid of columns that goes up, behind the theatre going up and down, outside the shopping part, the hotel entrance on this side that goes up to things above. If you look at it in section, the hotel runs in front of the theatre. The theatre has its the thing you have for scenery going up, residential on the side there, and the tower. And the tower is an office block. And at the top of the office block is the architect's office, which is where Alder and Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright practiced. There hadn't been, although there'd been steel frame buildings, there hadn't been anywhere all those functions were put together in such a dense, amalgamated way. If you might say it's a rather sort of naive way. But I recommend going to see that building. It's clad on the outside in stonework a la Richardson than in the sort of Romanesque style that was done. That doesn't really matter on that building. The interiors, basically all the structure, Sullivan did the most marvellous cladding within it that you could redo cladding. But I'll show you one more quickly. The Reliance Controls building by Burnham and Root. This is a steel frame building in which if you see a detail of the section, the steel work at the back shoots up, and the way you do the outside is hung on the outside, and you make it of other materials. This stuff was shooting up all over Chicago, and was extremely exciting to someone who was used to stone carving and fairly smallish buildings, that you could do architecture of this sort. So he came back enamored of this. At the same time, being enamored with British tailoring. The idea that Englishmen went out and for recreation, you'd have clothes that actually allowed you to jump, shoot, whatever it is, what you're going to do. He was also enamored of because he had to work on plumbing. So cast iron pipes and anti-siphon pipes for your plumbing, and how you built round and through and did that. He was really thrilled by it, because you could saw the potential of what you could do. So when he was doing his pamphleteering, when he got back, I mean, this is a cartoon showing Mr. and Mrs. Schmidt, who go on a trip to London in their Austrian clothes, and they come back in their marvellous English clothes. You can see the neatly tailored things. As well as propaganding, he got into designing things. And this is one of his efforts at a chair. Clearly, it's a chair that's for flopping and reclining in, but it may not work particularly well, but it uses the upholsterers, it simplifies the upholsterers' techniques. What you can see, and this is actually later on, when Eileen Gray did her marvellous Bibendium chair, for those of you who know that, with the pizza house, the actual the reclining and the object that hold you together is done in a sensuous and quite subtle. Although these forms are quite simple and crude, they're actually quite subtle in terms of using them in furniture. A clock, I mean, fairly simple. Brass, how thick do you make a piece of brass, and how do you turn a corner in it and join it? You do it simply. A window thing. Chairs, going on to do chairs, adapting Thonet and Bentwood chairs. Glasswork, keep it simple, heavy, won't roll off the table, you can use it. He then got work for people that he used for Goldman and Salish were a tailoring firm in Vienna, and this starting off with an office for them. As you can see there, lined walls with a dado to cut the proportions of the thing I hide. With marvellous electrical light fittings, whizzing down with the bulbs on top. The desks, rather arts and crafts, simple. I mean, to our eyes these days, quite complicated, but at the time, quite striking. He went on to do cafes, which is where he was holding forth. One of the most famous, this is the Museum Cafe. It's the lower floor of that building you see in that thing there, white outside. Inside, very simple vaulted ceiling, Thonet chairs. Again, the features that you see are the light fittings, those lines that go across the wires to feed the fittings above. And the fittings themselves are hanging out. This photo, not a very good photo, but you can see there the effort that has gone in by the man who made the light fittings and the designer, who was Les, actually getting together and turning out something simple and functional, but working. His own flat was really quite simple. This is a plan of his flat he made. He actually, he lived most of his life, he lived out of this flat, although he travelled and he lived in Paris for quite a bit. He held on to this flat throughout his life, and basically this is the living part of it. Through the end here is the bedroom part beyond here. This is the living room part, and at the end of that, for one window, he did himself a British alcove nook. And you may chuckle when you see what it looks like now. I mean, to us these days, this sort of thing is the worst sort of pub, really, with the nooks and the fireplace. But at the time in Vienna, it was an extraordinary symbol. You can see the fireplace, the bookshelves. These metal cabinets here, very sadly, they contained actually a set of pornographic photos that a client of his gave him and he kept for all his life. And when he was prosecuted, actually knows himself, for paedophilia later on. And these cabinets that were here were the main evidence that were used against him in that case. I'm not going to go on about that too much because we're talking about the architecture. Anyway, there's the living room part of that with the fireplace moving up. I'm now going to go on. This is just a list of where we've got up to so far. The red part we're going to go on to now, which is a small bar that he designed, the American bar, and a very large apartment building that was quite controversial in Vienna at the time. The left-hand slide here is of the door to the bar, and I'm showing it that way there, so you can see that the marble, right? The vividness of the marble and the attention to the door handle, which is the way into, which you can see the lettering, American bar. On the right is a staircase in this large building that he did for the tailors, Goldman and Salish. And there you can see the use of veneers and colour and light and reflection. I'm going to talk a bit more about the bar. That's an outside view of the bar, a plan and a section. It is very small, this bar, but you can see the outside, the way the gaudy thing on the outside is prefiguring Jasper Johns, is the American flag here, as well as telling you it's the American bar. It basically has, you can see on the outside on the street, the marble of the sort I showed you in the other photo, 3 bays with 3 doors. If we go to the plan, the middle door is the entrance to the bar itself. The one next on this side is to somewhere else. So when you go through that door, you're shoved into a chicane lobby, keep you warm, before you get into it, and it's incredibly small. These are leather bench seats and table. The bar itself, which the barman behind you with the drinks here, divided into 3 bays. On the 3rd bay, there's a staircase down to the toilets down below. In section, you can see the leather banquettes where you sit. The ceiling goes up quite high, and I'll show you now a picture of that interior. This is a black and white original one. The leather seats, the bar, the clear story dado defined with mirrors. And a coffered ceiling, so that when you sit in this very small space, you are made aware of the fact that there is a world outside yours by the means of mirrors and coffering that repeat. The small little staircase down to the toilets, you can see there with the bar. This reflection of things going on through is your background. Backwards, looking to where you came in, there's an alabaster screen, so half translucent, but the material, a very material, glittering thing there. And you can sit on the banquette, or you can sit, as I did once, with where that lady sat. I didn't sit there, I sat there with Dennis Sharp, actually. For an afternoon, and the size and the atmosphere of this place I'm not a bar person, and I don't go drinking bars very often, but I remember in that place we sat there, and perhaps 1 or 2 other people came in, but it's an absorbing, at the same time stimulating atmosphere for a very small brief. Going on to the bigger building now, which was very controversial. This was the Taylor's, which was located right bang in the middle of Vienna for Goldman and Salish. Goldman did, here he is a picture of him, looking suitably Taylorish. Born 1875, died 1942, and 1942, he actually died in a concentration camp. So I'm putting you in terms of time, what happened to some of these people and some of these things. The building itself looked like that on the right, which may again not very remarkable to us these days. And on this map, which is of the centre of Vienna, it's located bang in the middle there, opposite the palace, with the Ringstrasse going round the outside, the river on this side. So it's an incredibly important site that this building was put on, and widening it out a bit. It's there. Now what you can see is that the proportions of the ground, the lower bit and the upper bit, are defined very precisely and with great contrast. Not like the adjoining buildings that are around it, that deal in piano nobiles and classical proportions. The upper bit, in fact you can't see it there, is rendered, and those rectangular windows are as if cut by a knife. They're incredibly simple. This was very controversial. The lower part, which goes through, is the tailor's part and goes through more than one story. I'll show you, but here's a section on here, okay, so that building, there's an awful lot going on in it. And like the auditorium building, this is a new, the other buildings around it were residential and palazzos and things like that. The introduction of this tailors on this scale, a retail use in that part of Vienna, on you can see the site, it's a difficult shape. And the tailor's part is located in this volume, a ground level, but it's got two levels underneath it as well that belong to it, and above residential in small bits, and then the top part, which again belongs to the tailors there. They own this shape here, and the main part for retailing was in the wide part here, and then fitting rooms off to the side. I'm showing you there, here's the engineer's drawing, all right, for that, so you can understand how functionally the retail space has these wide spans, whereas the residential is small above. And that is reflected in the external elevations, which were ridiculed at the time. This is a cartoon in Vienna saying, why is this architect giving us this thing that looks like a drain for us? In fact, the void, okay, which is the retail part, is the part that's done in this in very strong marble. The standing in it, that there is you get the contrast between the marble and the plane above, and the bays within it, which are translucent, not transparent, are angled. They repeat the angle of the overall angle of the building on its site. So there is a formal play of shape that. You get in the building itself, on the corner, its shape, and in the shape of the bays that let the light in to the inside. And the insides themselves, I've never got into this. It's a bank now, this building. I've got into it sideways through the end entrance, only seen it sideways. But you've seen the staircase before. But for buying and selling and getting dressed up and making you feel good, it sure is glitzy, a reflecting ceiling. These veneers that reflect the lights, a bad photo of the main staircase up, a view back to the outside, so there are these smaller bays where you try things on and let them. It went through, again, reflections there, it went through a lot of criticism. A great planning battle was fought, which ended in, I think, 5 or 6 flower boxes being stuck to the windows on the residential part, but they stayed in their render, which to him was the important thing about that. Render, where you lived, rendering was the neutral, public, acceptable face of being residential. And I'm going to come on now to residential buildings. He then did a series of houses for people like the tailors, but fairly wealthy, mainly Jewish families in Vienna who could afford to live on a sort of suburban lot. And they built self-contained houses, basically. And what I've got here is, if you like, is a floor plan of 9 of them. And they all had perimeter external walls that went right round them. Right round the outside, and the footprints would probably be anything between 8 to 10 meters. Sometimes they strayed bigger in size, which is quite large for us for a residential building. Some were smaller, sort of 5 or 6, and that structurally within that you could do a 3 or 4 story house with timber floors, and that sometimes if you provided one intermediate means of support halfway through, sometimes more than halfway through, sometimes just once in the middle. You could, in fact, in the internal planning, you could, with the timber floors, you could vary the heights of the floors with steps in between them, so that you could, as well as having partitions for the various rooms that went on, you could also vary the height of the rooms that you got. And it's using this as I don't know, Mr. Perrin, whatever, this idea, he provided them with quite successful houses. I'm showing a picture on the right. It's one in Prague, one of the last ones. It's this one here. You can see there that basically, as well as moving the floors around within the volume of the house. He also moved the windows and altered the heights of the windows, and sometimes stuck bits out, stuck bits on, or subtracted bits from the volume. So there's quite a variety of things that goes on. I'm going to show you more detail now. This is the Steiner house, which was featured in Pevsner book on modern architecture. I'm telling you here who the people were it was for. Hugo Steiner and Lily Steiner, you can see there the list of people they knew Schoenberg, all right, they were part of this, although they ran tailors' shops, they were interested in people like Toscanini, music, Toscanini, Kokoschka the painter, Mayol the sculptor, they were known, so they were fairly arty. This is a drawing of an elevation of their house, and this is what it looks like. So in this photo you can see it's an entrance you can see fairly well. It sits in the middle, and it has this curved roof that mounts up. If you go around the other side, it's gone up to 3 stories, and it's got a basement. Again, very simple and rendered, but it's rectangular on that side, so different on the two sides, the street side and the garden side. Your face to the world. That's a more recent photo, which makes it look rather po-faced, but that's the street again. So you can see the scale of this building in relation to the ones that are outside of it. The curved roof is part of that. End elevations of that. Windows free inside. In section, a basement and steps where you come up, and you can see the masonry walls, concrete one at lower level, but the timber floors that are varied, and the fact that when you get to the top there with this means of support, the roof completely changes. It's this street-facing one that's curved, and the other one that's rectangle, so they get more for their buck, for their money. Having seen the front and the outside, this is quite complicated drawings. There is a very good book by Rolf Polk, you can see on where you can follow your way around these houses, because they really are quite complicated. The levels keep changing, the directions keep changing. When you enter this house here, basically that's servants' parts there. You go into a lobby with a bay before you go up into the main part of the house. And as with them so often, the living part is, there is a part, they really did have grand pianos in, because they were interested in music, and they had places where they would play bridge or whatever, the social rooms up above. But the levels and the volumes of these rooms alter as you go up within it. I've got quite a number to show you. I mean, that is the, if you like, is the dining room that again, to our taste, like the bar, it looks a bit overdone, but beloved wainscoting of English arts and crafts. Your exposed timber ceiling, the lights where you want it. The windows, surprisingly for a room of this size, quite a large window, as well as a high-level window for softer light. I'm going on through several of these. This next house is for a man called Gustav Schuh, if I'm pronouncing it right, who was a lawyer, a politician in the Social Democratic Party, a city councillor and a Freemason, so he's clearly well connected with the way that Vienna worked at that time. His wife was an author, a translator and an editor. They were friends with, as well as Schoenberg, Avenberg, the other composer, and Kokoschka. Their house was on a larger footprint, all right? It was 11 meters by 60 meters, which is pretty big, basically on 4 levels, but very unusual because, although on 3 levels, it stepped back through 3 levels. Not only did it step back 3 levels so that each level had an outside terrace, as well as there being a garden on the ground floor, those steps are at sort of at right angles to the street pattern. There were actually 2 entrances to this house. The main entrance was this step that goes up. So you go up to go in on the side for the first bit that's stepped with a terrace above it. Around the side here, there's another entrance. I'll explain that a bit in a minute. The garden side, very plain. The windows divided into 2 sort of small parts, more translucent part and transparent part. The part of the planning thing on this was that it should have greenery that grows up it, so all the drawings and the photos show that happening. You can see here the terraces that go out from the rooms at the same levels as the rooms inside. If we come to the plan, I'll spend a bit more time on this. This is the street side. You've come up this stair here, and you enter on this side here. There is a sort of little reception vestibule room here, but you're led on through to the middle, and then off the middle to one side, there's this area with the staircase in it, which is a hall. Off the hall, there is somewhere where you can leave your clothes, There's also a thing called a veranda, which has opens out to the garden at the side. Beyond the hall, there is a music room. There is an ingle nook with a fireplace and a place for sitting rooms. And this mysterious staircase that goes from the outside on to the upper floors above. Above the bedrooms, come up the main stair from the main room. On this side, a big terrace outside the main bedroom. So upstairs for your main bedrooms, you do get a big terrace. That big staircase stops there. There is still this staircase here that's come up, but does enter to a room on this side. Also, to get to the next level, there's a second little, much more less recognised staircase. I'm not quite sure what all this is about. I know they had at least one child, and they may have had a maid as well. But this top floor has this staircase that comes from the first floor inside and from the outside. And it's a big room with a bathroom adjacent to it and a terrace outside. And my imagination runs riot, having looked at the plans of this house, with this politician from home actively that he's to carry on his life as all those things that he was doing and act politically well. He quite often probably have meetings with different sorts of people who he didn't want to mix particularly with his home life or his family, and they could nip in the staircase up to the top and do whatever they're doing quite separately or not. It may not have been like that, I don't know, but it is definitely an extraordinary house. I've only shown you drawings. This is the inside of the main hall with the main staircase off to the side, and again the ingle nook with its benches, the library to the side of it, the wainscoting, all quite simple. The dining room, you would have come in through this from the entrance. At that same ground level, you've got this really nice, quite different room, not heavy and dark, called the veranda, which is lit with these larger windows to the outside. And there's the stairs mysteriously to the top floor. Bedrooms within it, again, windows at different heights. So the very simple, startling form of this building does produce internally rooms that were clearly with the clients what they needed, although from the point of the street, it was quite an unusual thing. Leading on from Sceaux, at the end of the First World War, Vienna had terrible problems. And the number of homeless people that there were tended to were forming settlements and camps round the outsides of Vienna. So this is a picture of the river and of the Ringstrasse in the middle, and these outside where the woods were. And between these areas, there were people flocking in from the countryside and basically squatting. So there was a problem in what to do with these. Because of his association with Sceaux, clearly he got the post of borough architect in 1921, I think it was, only for 2 years. The parties changed and the socialists came in, and what became Red Vienna with the large blocks that the red painted, rather monumental blocks got built. And at that time, most of them moved off to Paris. But I just wanted to talk a bit about these settlement areas and what they raised. I'm going to show you where some built on this. Not many of them got built, but this one here at Leinz did got built. And this is a reminder of what's going on at that time. An awful lot of revolution and changes of politics. But what you see on the picture on the right is an allotment of a certain size. And there was a man called Lichard Mij, I think that's how you pronounce it, who was part of the Garden City movement, who was really interested in the idea of self-sufficient living. And couldn't you do that? And this coincided with these people who were just squatting on the outside of Vienna. So they got together and they produced, they thought of housing. How could you do self-sufficient housing? What size should it be? How should you lay it out? What sort of house do you need? What sort of size plot would you need? And they did various studies of these. And this is a diagram. You can't see it very clearly here, but that if you had a certain size plot and you had a certain size house, how many people could you accommodate? And they went into this in Mich was the theorist of this. They went into it quite seriously. This, I can't translate this one. This is in German. But you can see there that there are terraces with gardens attached to them, sort of stepped terraces. bigger and smaller ones, and then various other pieces of land that you could use in different ways. What did get built in Lantz was a housing scheme based on this principle, and the plans for these, you can see there the sort of layouts of the gardens behind, that you've got terraces with houses of different sizes. And Lewis himself, he devised a system for doing this that right, this is that a bit bigger, but it's quite interesting to see what was thought of in this house. Each of those houses is a different size. It's on a sort of sloping side. It's got things like a pantry, a stable, a composting. They were really keen on because of drainage, of making efficient, well-working compost toilets. A winter garden, that's to say a garden shed, a glazed garden shed you could grow things in. Sculleries, courtyard, stable, I can't see this. Yes, the stables is there, so you could keep animals as well. And they went through doing this. In section, these houses are a bit easier to explain. Very simple. This is the outside here where you could grow some plants. Inside where you had your stables and stuff for keeping your animals. In elevation, the party walls were thought of as being solid, but everything else was to be timber and flexible. This, if you can see it there, is his system for these walls and floors. And you can see there the stepping of the house where you could perhaps have terraces in the way that the shoe house worked. So very little of this got built, but I think it was extremely, here's the some that did. So the outside windows, they probably had insulation added on the outside. You can see the depth of the walls here with the windows, but these things for growing things on the outside, and another view of those contemporary now with the gardens. I don't think they're clearly not self-sufficient, but as an idea, it's something that has a lot of mileage in it. As well as that, again the back of those, as well as that, higher density housing, again, step terraces. He had a go at step terraces. None of these got built, and people said, well, what you put in the part it's all very well with these ones on the front here with the chairs, what you put in here, which we know at Rowley Way in Camden, Neve Brown put the cars, and Lewis's answer, I think, was that you put the fire engine, fire station, and things like that there. They're quite interesting, actually, in that the terraces here they're actually in between spaces, which to me, when I was a housing architect, was always really interesting to try and go. They don't go very far. You get on the end and you get off somewhere where you live. He did various numbers of these that didn't get built. When the regime changed and he had to look for work, he tried developing those sorts of ideas. This was for a scheme, I think, in the south of France, where you had stepped terraced housing assembled in a various way. I'm going to go on now and show you one more of these freestanding houses in 1922, before he moved to Paris in the hope of more work there. And by then he'd got to meet, I don't know whether I pronounce her name right, Margaret Schüttelkosk, the lady who did the Frankfurt kitchen for Ernst May and survived World War II. He knew her at that time, and those things with the compostable toilets, they were all keen, or they were into that. Anyway, this house, which is for a sugar merchant and his wife, who knew, well, the children, well, the child became an assistant to Schoenberg when he moved to, clearly later on, 33, in Berlin. This is on a 10 by 10 footprint, so it's a slightly smaller footprint. And it has not only walls, windows at random places in the outside walls. You can also see that here's a piece of sculpture. I think those convinced them to have that there because he didn't want them looking out of the window that way. He wanted them looking out the window the other way. But I think that's the story that's associated with this house. But this is a very simple illustration of the outside walls and the inner pier or inner walls where for each of the four parts of it, you could vary the heights of the spaces. Entering in the middle, you come into a quarter of it, which is the largest lobby, which I'll show you in more detail in a minute in the picture, has an entrance area there and a staircase on the outside wall that goes up to the floor above. And as you rise, you turn 90 degrees, and on one side of you is this little office part where Mr. I've forgotten his name. Anyway, he could spot you coming out before you arrived and be there ready to greet you. He's on a sort of higher level than this, which is on a different level from the main living area of the house, the kitchen part there, the inevitable music room, and for sitting and enjoying the music, and the outside terrace are assembled on the outside there. I have got, that's the elevations of that, but I wanted to show you the inside of that because it's difficult to describe these spaces. People have said there's the way the window, as the room shapes change inside, so the window shapes change inside. You've had a lot of drawings from me. Let's have some photos. Right, this is a picture of this room. Sorry. This is a picture of this room on the lower ground floor where you've entered and come in, looking at that wall there, which is the staircase as you go up in it. And you can see here the scale of this space is quite high with its dado, but it leads on to the space above, and you can sort of snickle off to the side to things that you need to get to. As you go up, which you go up here, the levels change by half, and you have sort of balustrades where space flows through at different heights and then on up. There you can see one of his clocks. Here's an axonometric. Those of you who are architects here can read these better, but you can see how these volumes interlock and flow from one to the other. Not flowing in the way that Corbusier's space would flow, but just sort of for use, for the way you relate to other people doing the various things that you're doing at home. I mean, the furniture, you have to have a plan with the furniture to see the actual scale of things and how you use it. Everything is considered. You can choose your own fittings and stuff. But then again, this is moving up that space even higher. This is up on this space here, where you're looking back on the other ones. They're at a different height. And again, across that in the part where you change at one side where it was a balustrade, the other side it's a cupboard. So the total interior is designed to, and again, a sort of boudoir space where you sit one side there. And then when you get to the top, a quarter of it, there's a terrace on the outside. Going on now, he moved to Paris because he hoped that there would be more work there. He built a house for the poet Zara, which I'm going to show you. But what I wanted to show you was, sorry, to move backwards. Wanted to show you was this picture here. This is in 1926 in Paris, and this is in Montparnasse in Paris, and it's on the back of a thing called Chateau d'Yarn, which I've been told was a place where you could buy artists' materials. And the people in this group are a mixture of architects and artists who have been to the Dome Cafe in Montparnasse, which is just across the road. And this man here is Adolphe Loos. This man is Prampolini, who's an Italian futurist poet. The man that Loos is talking to is Neumann, is his assistant. A number of these others are artists here. But the one who's standing here looking a bit wobbly, I'll show you because is Piet Mondrian. Because Piet Mondrian lived in Montparnasse in the Rue de Depart, and he had his studio there, which is extremely small. And here you can see Loos, the architect, in his dapper suit. And Mondrian, who was very precise about the way, not only his paintings, but the way he lived.
He looks as though he's about to pick his pocket or something.
He looks a bit worse for wear, doesn't he? I think this is a really entertaining picture of Mondrian. The hat is slightly askew. I mean, I've got the feeling that they all had a good few drinks, and this is the sort of, you come out of the dome, out of the dome, and down the street. But I'm showing it to you because the milieu in which Loos at this time in the 1920s, he did architectural work, but and he employed people like Neumann. He employed him, and he employed people like Ernst Freud. who passed through, but he never quite had the proper sort of office. He was always in somebody else's office to get things done. And I've left a Mondrian. I'm pointing there to say that here's this architect and this architect having fun. I'm showing you now one of the things, a house, again, one of these square rotating corner houses, one that didn't get built, a villa he designed in Venice in 23. I'm showing you, the important thing about this is, although it was never built, it's the date. It was done in 1923, which was the year that Van Doesburg mounted his De Stil exhibition in the gallery with the models by Rietveld that I've given a talk about Corbusier and the Maison La Roche and how halfway through that exhibition affected the way he went on with the Maison La Roche. This is at that date is a Loos house that's there, and you can see in the photos there that it has a sort of staircase that is external to the house, going round it. There are ways of getting in and out of it at various levels on the outside. And one of the interesting things about this was that at this time in 1923, as well as that exhibition on De Stil, Jean Badovici had been financed to get his magazine Architecture Vivant going, and this was published in that, and Eileen Gray, who was with Badovici at the time, took this design and she thought she could do a bit better. So she took, this is her drawing, the Mimosy, which she introduced first of all a ramp down so you could park a car underneath it, and took the external staircase and moved it away and opened up and explored what you could do, starting with the basic cube that Loos had done in umpteen different ways, what you could do by shifting space within it. Here's her, having seen Rietveld and the De Stil, not being an architect, getting into architecture with Badovici in manoeuvring these things in and out on that house. It was never resolved, but it's the way that these houses have been designed by Loos is actually, I'm not sure, I've only shown you a couple of them, they're very varied. I think it was really quite sophisticated in its way and very subtle in the way it slightly shifted things. Going on, he got the job to do Zara's house. Am I doing all right for time? We've got till 9 o'clock, haven't we?
We're over 9 o'clock.
We're over 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
I was worried about the timing on all this. I'm going to hurry up. The Zara house was on 7 or 8 levels, all right, the way these things twisted through. Quite different from one side to the other. Zara himself was a poet there. He had these great spaces inside it and could use. And I'll whiz on from that to Josephine Baker and the house that he did not build, but he did a scheme for Josephine Baker, the dancer and performer, with a swimming pool in it. I will own up to having copied this for a swimming pool. Later on, I'll move on through that to the Moller House in Prague, which is one of the finest and has spaces that I've been in this one. You can go, and it's owned by the Israeli government now, that has these very complicated spaces that move through inside it, like that. Where I've described entrances on the cube where the floor moves. Here, the walls themselves are penetrated, so this is in the entrance lobby. The main living areas are up above. The way the space is. I've been terminated. I think we'd better stop. Yes. Yes. I was going to end. Go ahead. Yeah.
What about that?
I'm sorry about that.
This is just one of Philip's great talks, and we have a lot of talks from Philip.